Okay, so Foucault, right? We're going deep on Foucault today.
Mhm.
Specifically, his afterword to power knowledge. Like, this is like getting a peek behind the curtain, seeing how his thinking evolved over time. And we're going to unpack why that matters. And not just like in some ivory tower, but like in your everyday life.
Yeah, definitely. It's not just theoretical. I mean, in this afterword, you really see that shift in his thinking from like just analyzing knowledge to this whole idea of power knowledge. And that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, no, totally. And one thing that jumped out at me was how much the events of May 68 in France were like a turning point for him. What was it about that period that like so profoundly shifted his thinking?
Well, I mean, May 68 was this huge, social explosion, really challenged those traditional power structures. And, Foucault is right there witnessing how knowledge, institutions, power, how it was all like tangled up together. And that fed directly into his work on the human sciences.
It's funny, it's easy to think about fields like psychology, sociology as being like neutral, but Foucault's arguing they have this like hidden link to power. How did he even start like unraveling that?
Well, he started by going way back, like way, way back, using what he called an archaeological approach. Basically, he like dug into the historical emergence of these fields, it's works like Madness and Civilization, The Birth of the Clinic, The Order of Things, looking at the conditions that made it possible for these fields to even exist in the first place.
So it's not just what these fields say, but like the unspoken assumptions, the historical forces that shaped them.
Precisely. But then his focus kind of evolved, right? Moved into something he called genealogy. And instead of just like origins, now he's tracing how power relations are like embedded within the human sciences. And for like a perfect example of that, you can look at his work on psychiatry.
Right. Where he talks about how we went from just like observing madness to actually defining it, controlling it. Like the act of categorizing gives it a power it didn't have before, which leads us right into this idea of power knowledge. And it feels like this is like way more than just those in power using knowledge, but something way more like intertwined.
Yeah, you're getting at like the core of it. For Foucault, power and knowledge, they're inseparable, right? Knowledge isn't this neutral tool. It's always caught up in power dynamics, often creating power itself.
So it's not just a king using knowledge to like control his subjects, but that the whole concept of what a king is, what power is, comes from a certain kind of knowledge.
Exactly. And power is not some, big bad guy in a castle. It's fluid. It circulates through society, through relationships, institutions, even our own bodies. It's kind of everywhere and nowhere at the same time.
Okay, my brain is officially starting to hurt. So if power knowledge is this like pervasive force, how do we even begin to understand how it works in, a concrete way?
Well, Foucault gives us some tools for this. He talks about strategies, technologies, and programs of power.
Okay.
So like think of strategies as the like overall goals, technologies as the specific methods that they use, and programs as the organized systems that like put those methods into practice.
Okay.
Let me give you an example. Jeremy Bentham's panopticon, you familiar with that?
Vaguely. It's that prison design, right? Circular central tower.
Exactly.
But how is that a good example of power knowledge at work?
Okay, so the panopticon, right? It's not about brute force. It's a technology of power because it creates this like constant possibility of surveillance.
But
Even if there's no guard in the tower, the prisoners feel watched, so it shapes how they behave, right? It like embodies how power knowledge is internalized, becomes like self-regulating.
it's like how we all like police ourselves online now because of this feeling that someone's always watching. Like we self-censor, we present this certain image because of that, unseen gaze, which is kind of creepy if you think about it. But if power is this pervasive, is there even any room for like resistance?
Well, that's kind of the cool part, right? Foucault doesn't just leave us like totally powerless. He says resistance is like built into power itself, like
Real.
two sides of the same coin.
So it's less about like overthrowing power completely and more about recognizing those like pressure points, the places where we can actually like push back.
Yeah, exactly. And that resistance, it can look like a million different things. Protests, art, even just like little everyday acts of defiance. Foucault, he wasn't into anyone claiming they had the right way to resist. It's more about understanding how power is working in that specific situation and then getting creative to disrupt it.
So instead of like one big blueprint, it's about being adaptable. Kind of like, I don't know, a judo master using their opponent's weight against them.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And it reminds me of one of Foucault's like big things, this idea of analyzing the history of the present, right? He wasn't content with just, digging through old books. He wanted to see how those past power struggles are still shaping us today.
So, like, when we talk about, I don't know, something like mental health today,
Mm.
are we saying that understanding isn't just based on, like, pure science, but also on this whole history of how power has shaped how we view madness?
Exactly. Think about like how madness was viewed back in the Middle Ages. It was often seen as like a spiritual experience, even a source of like wisdom. But if we use genealogy, we can trace how that whole view got like totally transformed as power dynamics shifted, right? Became something to be like feared, categorized, controlled by institutions. Our whole understanding of mental health now, it comes from that history.
It's such a good example of how something we see as, like, objective truth is actually shaped by, like, all these other forces, right? It makes you think twice about just, like, blindly trusting experts or institutions. It's about understanding the context, the history.
Yeah, absolutely. And Foucault would say this isn't about like rejecting medicine or science altogether. It's about being more critical, asking who benefits from this particular kind of knowledge, who benefits from this particular way of seeing the world.
Like, he's giving us this new lens to examine not just the past, but, like, everything around us right now. And speaking of that lens, you mentioned he goes back to the order of things. That one always seems kind of, I don't know, intimidating. What's he getting at in that one?
Well, the order of things, that's where he really digs into how like whole systems of knowledge have shifted over time. He uses this term episteme to talk about like underlying structures of thought. What even counts as knowledge in a specific period, right?
So, like, the rules of the game, they change.
Yeah.
What's, like, common sense one day is totally unthinkable in another.
Exactly. Like he points out how during the Renaissance, knowledge was all about like resemblances and analogies. They thought plants had medicinal properties based on how they looked. And then boom, the scientific revolution hits and it's all about classification, categorization. Think Linnaeus and his system for plants and animals.
So it's not that we just, like, learn new facts. The way we think about knowledge itself is transformed.
Yeah.
You're saying these, like, epistemic shifts, they're not random. They're tied to power.
Exactly. New ways of knowing. They create new ways of exercising power, like the rise of statistics. Suddenly you can track populations, measure crime, all this stuff, all justified by this like aura of objective data, right?
Yeah.
But it creates whole new forms of social control.
It's like what we think is neutral, objective is often, like, anything but.
Which brings us back to power knowledge, right? It's not just some like grand history thing. It's in our institutions, our ways of thinking, even our own bodies. Yeah, it's like by making things, visible, measurable, we kind of make them open to like new ways of controlling them too, right? It's weird when you think about it.
Yeah, totally. Makes me think, like, what would Foucault say about, all the data we have today? Algorithms that seem to, like, know us better than we know ourselves. But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, I think it's important to remember, Foucault doesn't just leave us with this, like, power is everywhere, give up kind of message. He obviously sees resistance as, like, built into power itself.
Yeah, that's key, right? For Foucault, power is not just this like big oppressive force that crushes everything. Resistance, it's like an inherent part of how power works. It's always there, pushing back, creating friction, opening up new possibilities. He even talks about how systems kind of absorb resistance, right? He uses this image like cogwheels, belts, which don't work, but they end up making the whole thing work.
It's like what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but for, like, systems of power, right?
Right.
They adapt, they evolve, they figure out how to use dissent to, like, keep their grip.
Exactly. So just like fighting power on its own terms, that's often a losing game. For Foucault, effective resistance, it comes from really getting how power is working in a specific situation and then finding these creative, often unexpected ways to like mess with it.
So less about, like, head-on collision, more like, I don't know, being sneaky like a hacker, finding those weak points in the system. Where do you even start looking for those, though?
Foucault would say, look at the everyday places where power is at work, right? Schools, hospitals, prisons. These institutions, they might have different goals, but they often rely on similar like technologies of power, often creating what he called this sense of constant surveillance.
Right, that panopticon idea again, but, like, everywhere. We internalize the rules, we watch ourselves, even when no one's actually, like, looking over our shoulder.
Exactly. Think about how schools use like grades, tests to rank students, right? How workplaces use performance reviews to keep tabs on employees. It's not always about punishment, but it's about shaping how people behave, making them, productive.
Mm.
And technology, man, it takes all this to a whole other level.
Yeah, it's like we're living in a digital panopticon, right? Social media, cameras everywhere, these algorithms that seem to know what we want before we do. Kind of freaky when you think about it.
Yeah, it can be. And the ways power knowledge works now, it's often subtle. It's everywhere but hard to see. And that's exactly why Foucault is so relevant. He gives us the tools to spot those hidden mechanisms, to understand how they work, and then to start figuring out how to resist.
So it's not about like ditching our phones, going off the grid. It's about being more aware, more critical, asking those tough questions like whose interests are really being served by this technology, this institution, this whole way of seeing things.
Absolutely. And that's where I find hope in Foucault. It's not about being like gloomy or giving up. It's about empowerment.
Yeah.
When we understand how power works, we can start to take back some control. We can carve out spaces for freedom, for creating a more just world.
That's a powerful place to leave it. Foucault, he can be tough to wrap your head around, but it's so worth it. He makes you think differently, see the world in a new way, never stop questioning.
He reminds us knowledge, it's never neutral. History is always in the mix. And even when power seems huge, there's always the possibility of, pushing back, making things change.
This has been an amazing deep dive. We just scratched the surface on Foucault, but hopefully it gives you, the listener, some new tools for thinking about how power and knowledge are working in your own life.
Remember how Foucault said every system of power, it creates its own forms of resistance, right? So the question for you is, where do you see those possibilities? What are those subtle acts of defiance, those creative ways to disrupt things that might be chipping away at the structures that try to, define us, limit us?
That's something to think about as we wrap up. So until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and yeah, keep resisting.